Welcome everybody to class number 2, Journey of the Soul. It's great to have everybody back. There was I thought last week went very well. A nice crowd. Nobody asked any questions, which is the way I like it. It's nice and safe. So hopefully we'll do more of the same today if you guys can keep up that good behavior. Which is there's this couple was on a date. They were on a shidduch date. And the guy had made up with his friend to call him about an hour into the date in case it wasn't going well. So like that, he'd have an excuse to leave for something really important. He'd have a little exit strategy. And sure enough, an hour in, the date was going sideways, and suddenly his phone's buzzing in his pocket. So he says, "Excuse me, I'm expecting a really important call." He runs out to the back, and he comes back in a few minutes later looking very grim. And he says, "I have terrible news for you. I'm very sorry. I was just informed that my grandmother passed away. I have to go." And the girl looks at him and says, "Thank God." He says, "Excuse me?" She said, "If it wasn't your grandmother, in 5 minutes, my grandmother was about to die." So that joke somehow was a segue from my opening statement to the next statement. Maybe not a good segment. Maybe it was too soon. I don't know. But actually tonight's class will be dedicated in memory of my wife's grandmother, whose yahrzeit was today, as a matter of fact, Mrs. Rebbitzin Kenya Darren. So tonight's class will be in her memory. I think it's a fitting topic tonight and fitting memorial. So without further ado, let's jump into tonight's class. Okay, so tonight our tonight's class is gonna be 5 sections. We're gonna go through 5 areas, and which is gonna be divided really into 4 parts. Okay, number 1, we're gonna talk about the moment of passing. Number 2, we're gonna talk about the soul's departure from the body. Number 3, we're going to talk about 3 and 4. We'll talk about the traditions of handling the body of the deceased and its burial. And number 4, which will be section 5 or topic 5 of tonight's class, we will talk about visiting the gravesite of loved ones. Okay, that's tonight's class. Again, hopefully you have your textbooks. You can follow along inside. I cannot share it on the screen. I do not have the PDF. So you'll just have to bear with us when we read through some texts. Hopefully we will be able to keep everybody following and on board. Okay, so last week we talked about the Jewish perspective on death, right? And we discussed the fact that as Jews, we don't fear death. We're not afraid of death because death isn't final. And on the other hand, we don't celebrate death because even though the soul is eternal and lives on forever, life does not die. And so a living being does not die. They just graduate to another stage in the eternal life of the soul. But at the same time, death is a tragedy in a sense, and we'll explore some more of that actually tonight, in the sense that even though life in this world is only a blip on the radar of the eternity of the life of the soul, nevertheless, it is life in this world where the soul enters into the body that the soul actually gets to fulfill the divine purpose for creation. In other words, this is where the action is in this world. And when the soul separates from the body is returned to where it came from, which we're going to talk about tonight. And the soul returns to where it came from and continues its eternal life. And we talked about the bliss that the soul feels, the pleasure that it feels in the world to come. Nevertheless, the fact that the soul is leaving this world, the world of action, and sort of retiring is a bittersweet kind of experience, more bitter in a sense than sweet, because as godly beings, what we really want more than anything else is to fulfill the purpose for which God creates us, and that can only be done in this world. So tonight we're gonna take another deeper look into some elements here of this overarching theme, right? So again, death is not the end of life. Life does not end. But what happens with the body and the soul when they separate? We're going to take a closer look tonight. Now we're going to open with a mystical text. Actually, we actually quoted part of this text last week. But tonight we'll give a little bit more of an introduction, some background, some context to this text before we dive right in, because it's a complicated Kabbalistic text. The text we're going to read on page 43 in your student book, text 1a, is an excerpt from the Tanya. The Tanya is the classic work of Chabad philosophy written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was born in 1765, passed away 1745, passed away in 1812, and he was the founder of the Chabad Chassidic movement. And his Tanya, the part that you may be more familiar with, the first section of Tanya, which talks about the Beinoni and the way it gives us a path to serving God. The Tanya, that's the first part of the Tanya, the more famous part, but the Tanya actually has 4 parts, and the 4th part of Tanya is actually a collection of his letters. One of those letters, letter 27, is a letter of consolation. The letter, and that's what we're going to read text 1a in a moment. So the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Shneur Zalman, also known as the Alter Rebbe, the Old Rebbe, or the original, the first Chabad Rebbe. So I'll switch back and forth probably between Rabbi Shneur Zalman and the Alter Rebbe, which is Yiddish, the Yiddish title by which he's known colloquially among Chabad Chassidim. After his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, passes away, Rabbi Dovber of Mezrich, he passes away in 1772. After he passes away, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who is one of the youngest of his teacher's disciples, turns to one of the elder disciples of his teacher. So he was a friend, sort of a contemporary, but also older enough that he looked up to him, and he turned to this student to be sort of his teacher, right? So friend / teacher. His name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok, or Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. Came from Horodok, from Vitebsk, both places. This Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok led the Chassidim in that region for a little while, starting after his teacher's passing in 1772. And then in 1777, he led an aliyah to the Holy Land, to Israel. A group of Chassidim, of mystics, made aliyah to the Holy Land. This is something that had been going on, and they put together a group to go move up to Israel, which at that time was totally impoverished. It was very hard to make a living there. There was not much going on there. And the people who lived in Israel, in the Holy Land, were very, very poor. Maybe we'll return towards the end of tonight's class, actually, to why people like to go to Israel and why they like to make aliyah towards the end of their lives. Maybe we'll return to that point later. But anyway, he's leading a group. And of course, who didn't want to go to Israel? And so Rabbi Shneur Zalman as well wants to go to Israel. He joins this group. They start to go. This is in 1777. And at some point during the journey, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok and his friends, they tell Rabbi Shneur Zalman, you've got to turn back. You've got to go back to Russia. We're appointing you as the leader of the Russian Jewry, of the Hasidic Jews of Russia, and by default, really by extension of Russian Jewry. And so Rabbi Shneur Zalman returns back to Russia, where he founds the Chabad movement and where he leads the Russian Jewry for the rest of his life, until 1812 when he passes away. Now, actually, just as a side, I mentioned this is a letter of consolation that is printed in the Geret HaKodesh, in the letters section of the Tanya. Most of the letters in that section of Tanya are actually letters about charity. Because one of the things that Rabbi Shneur Zalman did upon returning to Russia was he had the responsibility to support the poor in Israel. That was one of the things he did, and he raised large sums of money throughout Russia that he would send to the Holy Land to support the people there who were unable to make a living. There were just no opportunities for them there. And the Jews that lived in Israel at the time were really destitute, so he would send them money. And most of these letters in that section of Tanya deal with charity, because one of his main focuses during his leadership was to raise money to send to the Jews living in Israel. Anyway, that's number one. So then in 1788, Rabbi Menachem Mendel passes away. And so here he was the leader of this group of mystics and of followers in the Holy Land, who life was not easy for them there. He passes away. He's buried in Tiberias, I believe. It is where he's buried. And so Rabbi Shneur Zalman pens a letter of comfort, of consolation to these followers who are bereft in mourning and grieving the loss of their leader. So this is a letter that he wrote at that time in 1788. That's introduction number one. Introduction number two to this letter is that the soul has 5 levels to it. There are 5 parts to the soul. Right, you might be familiar with the 5 prayers that we pray on Yom Kippur. The 5 prayers corresponding to the 5 levels of the soul. On a regular day, we pray 3 times a day. Why? Because we can only access the lower 3 levels. On a holy day, on a Shabbos festival, we are a little bit holier, a little bit more spiritually sensitive. We can access the 4th level. On Yom Kippur, 1 day a year, we can access even the highest level, the essence of the soul, the highest level of the soul. So we have 5 prayers corresponding to these 5 levels of the soul. What we're concerned with for the purpose of this letter is the lowest 2, maybe the lowest 3, but specifically the lowest 2. So when the soul enters the body, it's really only a small portion of the soul that enters the body. The majority of our soul remains in heaven, doesn't come into the body. The higher levels of the soul, certainly they don't enter the body. They're our soul, they're all part of the soul, but they remain outside the body. They're too big, as it were, to enter into the body. The lowest level of the soul, the one that enters the body, the one that fuses with the body and animates the body, the lowest level, that's called nefesh. That's the name of that level, nefesh. Nefesh, which means soul. Really, the name of all of these is kind of soul. But nefesh is often, the word nefesh or neshama, you might know the word neshama. Neshama is the 3rd level of the soul. So nefesh and neshama are really 2 different levels. Nefesh is more the physiological life force of the body that comes from that level of the soul. Higher than that, you have ruach, which would be spirit. Higher than that, neshama. Those are the 3 lowest levels of the soul that are connected with the body. So nefesh animates the body, enlivens the body. Ruach is the level of the soul, the spirit of the soul, that animates the emotions, one's emotion. And neshama, that is the person's intellect. Right? So the person's intelligence, the intelligence of the soul is in the level of neshama. The emotional aspect of the soul is in the level of ruach. And the physical living aspect, that life force of the soul, that would be nefesh. Now that we have this information, when the soul separates from the body, the nefesh, the lowest level, remains connected to the body and goes with the body to the grave. The higher level, the level of ruach, which is the emotions, that goes up to the lower level of the Garden of Eden, the lower level of paradise. And the 3rd level, neshama, returns to the higher, the upper paradise, Gan Eden Ha'elyon, the upper paradise. With that introduction now behind us, let's look at text 1a. And again, I apologize those of you who dropped late. I mentioned I can't share the PDF today, unfortunately, on the screen. So you'll just have to bear with us as we read through these texts. Okay. As is known, text 1a, page 43. As is known, the life of the tzaddik, right, which as we know already from last week, the righteous person, is not physical but spiritual. It consists of faith, reverence, and love of God. During the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these 3 attributes that belong to the soul dimension of ruach are constrained within the 3 attributes, meaning these the idea of faith, love, and fear, right? That they're all those 3 components of the emotions related to ruach are constrained within their container and garb, namely the nefesh, that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. Right, so we're talking about spiritual attributes, or emotions generally belong to the spirit, but they're also, even though they're spiritual, but they still are constrained by the time and space, right? When you have feelings, certain feelings occupy a certain spiritual space. And certainly here we're talking about them being confined to a specific part of a person's body. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from ruach is a revelatory handicap, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. By contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach and remains in the grave, while the ruach and its 3 attributes rise to Gan Eden. Consequently, whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, the faith, awe, and love with which the tzaddik served God, and not merely these attributes' outer glow that escape beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love. So what are we saying here in this text? The Alter Rebbe is comforting these people who feel this loss. And he tells them that the connection that you felt to the tzaddik during his lifetime was a spiritual one. What brought you to him? What connected you to him? What drew you to him? Was his spiritual life, his love, his faith, his fear of God, awe of God. That's what drew you to him. That's what you connected to, and that's what inspired you and influenced you. Well, during the person's lifetime, during the righteous person's lifetime, all of that was confined to a physical body, in a physical space. And therefore, the energy or the vibes that you can get from that tzaddik's awe and fear, and awe and love and faith was limited, was confined to a certain time or a certain space. I mean, in a sense, even more than that, it's confined because it always comes through the container, right, through the vessel. So, for instance, when we interact with people, there's so much we don't even realize how much we're distracted, right? You want to connect with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, and you really want to get to know them, you want to hear from them, and they start communicating to you, and you've come with an agenda to really get to know them, right? And yet you're distracted, maybe by their breath, maybe by the way they look, maybe there's a fly flying around the room, maybe what they chose to wear, but whatever the space that you're sitting in, there's so many things that could limit, right? Maybe their vocabulary, maybe their accent, maybe they have a speech impediment. There could be all kinds of things that interfere and really limit what you can actually get from them. Everything is tainted by your own biases or your own perceptions and so on. But when the tzaddik passes away, when that spirit is out of its container, now it's unrestrained. And therefore a person can get really to the essence of that tzaddik, of that energy. So that's number one. That after the tzaddik passes away, his impact has the capacity to be even greater because his influence is no longer limited by the limitations of the body. Furthermore, as we said, since, as he mentions here, since the nature of the connection is through love, so the love that remains even after the tzaddik passes away, that love is sort of a conduit that allows for even deeper connection than before. Let's take a look now at text 1b, a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, page 45. It's also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul from the body, whether a fatal accident or a fatal illness, etc., it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking, etc. Even a tzaddik whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem, to God, cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes for the soul to return home, it is essentially a release for it as it makes its ascent to a higher world, no longer restrained by a physical body and a physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being near to God in the fullest measure. So essentially, what we're saying is, think about during a person's lifetime, when you interact with them and you see them, you're limited. You don't even necessarily realize it, but your experience and your connection with them is limited by all kinds of other limiting forces and elements. But once the soul, the spirit, is separated from the body, all those limiting forces are no longer there. And so think about seeing somebody. You say you get to know somebody. I know this person's soul. If we can be so bold as to say something like that. But how well do we really know them? Do we really know them objectively, or is it subjectively? And when we get to know somebody, there's so many other factors, or when we connect to somebody, there's so many other factors and variables that mix in with that essential bond that we experience, which is, I think this really can explain something very interesting. A phenomenon that I've observed. So it's not very scientific. I'm not a scientist, so forgive me. But I noticed, just being around already for a couple of years, that when people lose a loved one, they're more likely to quote them far more often than they would during their lifetime. So you see somebody loses a parent, and the next thing you know, they're always quoting that parent. They never quoted them before. Suddenly now everything happens. My father would have done this. My mother said that. You're always quoting. Why? What happened? So look, so the very basic thing is, you miss somebody, you love somebody and you miss them, and absence makes the heart grow fonder. So you're always looking to connect in some kind of way. But this happens almost automatically and subconsciously. And part of the reason for that is because now you no longer are experiencing that bond with them with the limitations that were there during the lifetime. So maybe your mother was very annoying when she was alive. I'm not saying you, a person, not anybody that I'm looking at on the screen. God forbid, right? But maybe she was very annoying and you didn't always answer her phone calls, right? Or it made you nervous when she posted on Facebook because she was too old to be posting on Facebook. Although now people are too young to post on Facebook. It's switched. It used to be the other way around. I remember when kids were getting off Facebook because their parents were getting onto Facebook and it was just too humiliating, right? So you remember that, right? And then, but then suddenly when all that fades away, what are you left with? You're left with the essence of the person. You're left with the person's character. You're left with their morals, their values. You're left with things that endure, kind of like relating really to what we talked about last week. Remember, we spoke a little bit more about last week about soulful living. And so that connection is a deeper soul connection that is all pervasive, and you connect with them all the time. I was talking to somebody just last week, and I mentioned I felt this experience. I felt a little similar to what I'm describing now. I remember feeling it once very powerfully. My grandmother passed away 8 years ago. And about 6 months later, my son was born. And he was born right before Passover. His bris was on Passover. We're here in Florida. Our family lives all up, all over the place. Our parents, my grandfather may live and be well. They're up in New York. And to travel on Passover is a little difficult, specifically that weekend. It was very difficult for anybody to come. My father-in-law was the lone representative of all the members of our family. My father-in-law came and we honored him to be Sandik, and it was really a beautiful, beautiful experience. It was actually a deeply emotional, moving experience for me. But one thing I remember feeling at the time, now granted, it was 6 months after my grandmother passed away, but it was interesting that I felt the love of my family that couldn't be there in person. But the person whose presence I felt the most and whose absence I felt the most throughout the whole thing was my grandmother. I can't explain it. I could just tell you, it was something I was so aware of at the time. And I just felt it so strongly. Why is that? So possibly relates to what we're talking about now, because at that time, the soul is no longer chained to a body. So the people who love me and I love my family, I wanted to be here, but couldn't be here, and were with us in spirit, right? We know that people are, and they were celebrated where they were, and they made part, and it was all true. And we felt it to an extent. But ultimately, thank God these are people in bodies, and they should remain in bodies for a very long time. But because they're in bodies, they were in New York or New Jersey or somewhere else, and that's where they were. So what the presence, they weren't as present. My grandmother, on the other hand, who had passed away, was even more present. She was no longer restrained and limited by the body. Anyway, that was my personal experience. I just share that with you because I feel like it relates to this topic and gives a little insight into what we're talking about here, about the nature of life and the nature of the soul and the nature of the relationship after death, which is exactly what we're going to explore deeper now as we move forward. Okay, so in a sense, after a person passes away, the relationship continues. It doesn't sever. It doesn't break. It continues. A mother will always remain a mother. A father will always remain a father, and so on and so forth. That always continues. And now, after the passing, that relationship takes on another dimension, takes on another form, but one that is not restricted and not limited, where you can connect with the core of the person in a much deeper way than before. Okay. So that is number one, first topic we're going to talk about tonight. Now, having described this transition where the soul now is no longer tethered to a body, is no longer constrained and limited by the body, the fact that connections can be deeper, that leads us to the next step, which is the actual transition of the soul out of the body. What we described till now would seem to suggest that the soul is relieved when it leaves the body, The soul is out. Like last week, we talked about that the soul is not happy to leave the body. It's forced out of the body because the soul wants to fulfill a purpose. It wants to be where the action is, which is in this world, right? But okay, so that was one angle, one perspective. But what about the nature of the soul now continuing on? The bonds remain the same certainly from the soul's perspective, or even greater and deeper. What about now this transition out of the body? Is the soul at all bothered by it? So the truth is that when a person's at the end of their life, it's not a pleasant time. It's not a pleasant time for the person who's passing away. Not a pleasant time. I mean, obviously, we're not never mind whatever state, medical state they're in at the time. We're talking about, let's talk philosophically here, right? So when a person is towards the end of life, it is our responsibility and obligation to make sure that to ease that process as much as possible for them, to make that process easier for them. In whatever way. Now, obviously, end-of-life issues are legally very complex. Legally, I mean, from a Jewish halachic, Jewish legal perspective, they're very complex and complicated, and every situation is different and unique. And so rabbis need to be consulted when we talk about different types of treatments. That's not tonight's topic. We're not going to get into it. Just very generally and broadly, there's an effort made to ease to make them as comfortable as possible. When a person's at the end of life, even if they're no longer conscious, and they're sort of hanging on or in between two worlds, it's appropriate to visit them and to be with them and to talk to them, even if they can't respond, to reminisce and to share memories, positive memories, good memories. You could sync them. I brought my grandmother into the conversation already tonight. I remember I had been in New York right before she passed away. And we knew she had a serious fatal illness. And she had been in the hospital, and I had been in New York. It was the conference of Chabad rabbis in New York that weekend. I'd been in New York, and I went to spend time with my mom because it was my mother's mother. It was a very tough time. I wanted to just be there with her for the weekend. Anyway, it's Friday afternoon, it's in the winter, and it's a short Friday. At about 2:00, they get a call from the hospital. It's coming to an end. You might want to come. So suddenly my aunts and uncles, my grandfather, my mother, they all immediately just picked up and ran to Memorial Sloan Kettering, the dreaded hospital in Manhattan. They went running there to be there maybe for her last moments. I said, I came to New York to be here with my mom, and I can be there with my grandmother. I'm going. So I went and spent Shabbos there as well. And we sat there Friday night in her room around her bed, and we sang Shalom Aleichem, and we sang Geishes Chayil, and we made Kiddush, and some Kiddush was put on her lips, and she was already not responsive. But it was a very moving experience. And as it turns out, she held on for another week or two, another week, I believe it was. Maybe it was 2. I don't remember exactly the dates. But that Shabbos, we spent the Shabbos in her room, and everybody was obviously very emotional. And we sang Shabbos songs, and we shared words of Torah. And I remember particularly towards the end of Shabbos, the holiest time moments of Shabbos, which is the waning hours of Shabbos, we sat together and we studied something, a text together around her bed. It was a very powerful experience. And it was all part of an effort to really escort her, right, and surround her with positive energy and with holy energy. And that brings certainly comfort to a soul that is in distress because of its impending separation from the body. So these are all things that one could do when a person is nearing the end of life to help ease that transition, because the soul is in pain, right? As we can see in text 2. Let's take a look at text 2 from the Zohar. We're going to be quoting a lot from Kabbalah from the Zohar tonight. Nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. So why is that? Right? So this person who's at death's door. There's nothing as difficult as the separation from the body. Why would that be? So number one, it's a transition, right? It's a new stage in life. And we all know transitions are never pleasant. They're always difficult. They're always challenging. They're always uncomfortable. So anytime you transition from one stage to another, you go from one job to another, you're starting your first day at a new school, whatever it is that's going on, any transition is uncomfortable and you feel a little vulnerable and nervous. So that's number one, the soul's transition, that's number one. But deeper than that, as we mentioned last week, what do you want to say? Yeah.
Last week we talked about that they don't want to go into the body. I doesn't want to leave the body.
So really last week, we didn't do justice at the end. I was sort of wrapping up quickly, but the soul doesn't want to go into the body. It also doesn't want to leave the body. Eventually, there's a text that we didn't read. You can look back in your textbook about the soul being forced out of the body. Yeah, it doesn't want to leave. It doesn't want to die. And this is this next point directly follows from last week, which is why doesn't the soul want to leave the body? Why is it difficult for the soul? The soul wants to do mitzvahs. It wants to serve God, which you can only do in this body, in its body, in this world. And so it doesn't want to leave. And finally, the soul, it gets used to its surroundings. It comes into this world, it's in the body, and it connects to the body, is in a way, while it influences the body, it's also influenced by the body. And they've integrated to such an extent that the relationship between the soul and the body becomes part of the soul's identity. And to separate that would be to shake the soul's very perception of itself, in a sense, now having lived in this world in a body. You look at figure 2.2, that sort of outlines these three ideas. Okay, so the soul starts to leave at the moment of death. Person passes away, the soul leaves the body. But actually, it's not so simple. The soul doesn't just leave the body, and that's the end of it. Let's take a look at text 3 from the Jerusalem Talmud. For 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. So you see that the soul, this text shows us how connected the soul feels to the body. The soul suddenly out of the body, and suddenly it feels like, what's going on? It's separated from the body. It looks down. It sees the body. I don't want to bring in the concept of near-death experiences, but there's that's a whole other topic. But there's a certain common, I think, narrative in NDEs, in these near-death experiences with people, where they see themselves from the outside, right? So that's sort of this idea where they can see themselves in like the third person. They see their body. They may be flying to the top of the room, or that people describe that. So here the soul is experiencing that, where the soul sees its lifeless body and wants to go back. And so for 3 days, it's hoping it can get back in until it realizes that it's reached the point of no return. So this is obviously very stressful for the body, for the soul. The soul is hoping to get back, and the soul doesn't want to leave the body. It stays and hovers and comes back and forth for 3 days. So that's the first step of what happens after the soul leaves the body. It's looking back to the body, wants to come back to the body.
Who says this information?
I'm sorry?
Who's the one that said this?
This is from the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay. The sources are all in the textbook. Let's look at text 4a. For 7 days, the soul goes from, this is from the Zohar, again, from Kabbalah. For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. Okay, that's another quote from the Zohar. So for 7 days, the soul is going back and forth from the body and back to the grave. So a person passes away, they're buried, and then the soul is going back and forth from its home to its body, which is left somewhere else in a grave, and it's going back and forth. This is, by the way, one of the reasons we're going to talk a little bit more about Shiva now and next week as well, but why people make an effort to sit Shiva, which we'll talk about again. We'll get to this topic. But why they sit Shiva specifically in the house of the person who passed away, because the soul of the deceased is in their house. They're going back and forth for 7 days, from the house back to the grave, back and forth, trying to figure out where it goes now. Text 4b, again from the Zohar. For 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. Okay, so that's for 30 days after the person passes away. And now let's look at 4c. For 12 months, the body still exists and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null and the soul rises and no longer returns. Okay, we're going to revisit this concept. This is a quote from the Talmud. We'll revisit this concept about no longer returning. We'll get to that also eventually. But here we see something interesting, which is that the soul leaves the body in stages, which is actually not unlike the way the soul enters the body. You know, the soul also enters the body in stages. So when does a soul enter a body? Right. So we all know there's a very hotly debated political issue about when life begins. Right. We don't have to get into that conversation. But from a Jewish perspective, the soul starts entering the body already from before conception, and then at the moment of the conception, and then as it forms in the mother's womb, and then at the moment of birth, and then at the moment of a circumcision for a boy, or the baby naming for a girl, and then finally at the bar and bat mitzvah, the soul fully enters and integrates with the body. But you see, it comes in stages as well. It doesn't just enter in one fell swoop. And similarly, when it leaves, we've got 3 days, we've got 7 days, we've got 30 days, and we've got a year. Does this timeline sound familiar to anybody? Well, we know that the mourning period that's prescribed in Judaism follows these numbers, 3, 7, 30, and 12, right? And now we can understand why. We'll get a little bit more insight into this in a moment. So the point is that as the soul leaves the body, the mourning that is done down here by the loved ones that it leaves behind follows this process through which the soul is leaving this world and leaving this body. Let's take a look at text 5 from Maimonides, a legal text from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. Text 5 on page 52. Mourners observe 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining the celebration of friends, and traveling on business. So we see that we've got the Shiva, familiar all with Shiva. Shiva, the word Shiva means 7, and that's because of the 7 days of mourning. The 7 days of mourning are actually really 2 stages within those 7 days. The first 3 days and then the last 4, right? So it's 3 days of weeping, the next 4 of the 7, or really all of the 7, really all for eulogizing, for reflecting and remembering and sharing stories about the deceased. And finally, there's the 30-day mourning period. And of course, we know there's also a 12-month period of mourning after a parent that goes on that full year. We didn't get to Kaddish. Kaddish is another topic we're gonna get to another time. Okay. Text 6. Text 6 tells us that there's different ways in which we comfort mourners, people that are in mourning. So it depends whether it's within 30 days, whether it's after 30 days, with the type of loss that they experienced. And so we see that there's this sensitivity and awareness of the grieving that is taking place by the loved ones down here, that is paralleling the process through which the soul is undergoing at that very moment. Okay, so next week we're going to get more into these details of Shiva, of Shloshim. We're going to get into the grieving process. That's really next week's topic. It's not tonight's topic. The reason we're just addressing it here tonight is because what we're curious here about is about the process, the journey of the soul out of the body. And so therefore we see that these mourning traditions correspond to that journey. Okay, but the actual mourning itself we'll get to next week, God willing. Okay, so here's something interesting. Let's take a look at text 7. And this will give us a new perspective even on the whole mourning experience as well. Text 7 on page 54. This is from the Talmud. If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased's home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there are no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest." So this is a curious story and really a curious law. What is going on here? If nobody's left to grieve, so why have a Shiva? Why do you need to gather 10 people to sit in the deceased person's house, sit around? What are they doing? They're certainly not mourning. They may have not even known the man. But what does that mean? Because the point of sitting Shiva, part of it, is to comfort the deceased. When a person is sitting Shiva, there's the grieving process that they're going through. And again, that's next week's topic. But there's also the grieving that's happening with the escorting of the deceased that's taking place and the comfort that we're providing for the deceased. And so we're following them and empathizing, as it were, with what they are going through at this moment. Which is interesting. There's a when we go to the house of mourners, you go to a Shiva house, so there's a statement, a phrase, a blessing that we give the mourners, where we say that may the omnipresent, may God comfort you, among all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. That's the statement. That's obviously a very profound statement. There's a lot of depth to that statement. That's not tonight's topic. I want to focus on the opening words, which is Hamakom Yenachem Etchem. We say in the plural that may the omnipresent one comfort you. But you in Hebrew can be you in the singular, can be you in the plural. So it's you in the plural. And what if you have one mourner sitting at the house, there's only one person sitting Shiva, you still say etchem, you in the plural, not in the singular. You don't say otcha, for instance. Why not? Because when we're comforting the mourners that are sitting Shiva, we're actually also comforting the soul at the same time. So there's never one person in the house. There's the person sitting Shiva, but there's also the soul, which, as we mentioned, the soul is in the house, coming back and forth. We're also comforting the soul because the soul itself is distressed during this time. So we see how the laws of mourning are sensitive or are structured around the sensitivity we have to the soul's experience that it's going through. What about the body? What about the body's journey during this time? We focus now on the soul ascending and going up and down and back and forth. What about the body? A person passes away, what happens to the body? So the time-honored tradition in Judaism, all the burial rites are very important. And the common theme of all of them is that every corpse, every person who passes away is treated with the utmost respect. Maybe you could say it might even be treated with more respect than when they're alive. So let's go through some of what happens, okay? Let's look at text 8a and text 8b. Okay, let's take a look at this. When one who is present, yeah, we're on page 55. One who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. So when one, God forbid, sees a Torah scroll being burnt, the Torah scroll is the holiest object in Judaism, the holiest item in Judaism. When one sees, God forbid, a Torah scroll burning, they're required to rend their clothing, to tear their garments in grief and in mourning. And the same is true, somebody who's there at the moment of death. When somebody is present at the moment of death, they rend their garment. Interestingly enough, just parenthetically, once we're bringing up this law from the Talmud, actually, in reality, that's not, the rending of the garment is not practiced today for a very simple reason, which was back in the day, going back a 1,000 years or more, people didn't have a big wardrobe. And to rip your garments is a big deal. You have to fix them and repair them. You didn't just go you didn't go just online to replace your clothing. And so what was happening was people were avoiding being present at the moment people were passing away, which is certainly not any good. So this law was suspended so that people should be, because it was undermining the whole point of the law of rending your garments. Shows the great respect that we show to life and even to the body when a person passes away. And so therefore we tear the garments. But what was happening was people were taking their garments so seriously that they were avoiding people that respect, and they were trying to avoid that situation. So that stopped. So we don't do that now. Mourners, next of kin, relatives, children and siblings and so on, they do tear their garments, but that happens later. That happens usually at the funeral, and there are even laws about repairing them afterwards or not repairing them when you can't, and so on. But here we're talking about being present at the moment of death. What's the comparison? What's the comparison between the Torah and the human being? So let's look at text 8b from the Ritva, who says like this. Nachmanides, the Ritva, was one of the great Talmudic commentators from the 13th century. And he was a student of the student of Nachmanides, Ramban, not to be confused with Maimonides, Rambam, right? So he's a student of his student, and he says like this: Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. So the soul is like God's name. What about the body? The body would be like the parchment. But when you take parchment, something physical object, the hide of a cow or another animal that you can use, and you then work it and turn it into parchment that you then write God's name onto, the ink fuses with the parchment, and the whole object becomes sacred, becomes holy. So that even the parchment itself is holy. Not just God's name that's written on the parchment, but the parchment itself. Similarly, the body, which was previously a physical, lifeless thing, when the soul bonds with it, the soul being similar to the name of God, the holy name of God that is written into the body, it's seared into the body, that makes the whole body holy. And so the body becomes holy itself. The physical body is holy. And therefore, text 9, all who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity, a tool that serves a supernal soul. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness similar to a Torah scroll. So any handling of the body, the people who handle burial and preparing bodies for burial are called the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society. It's not for nothing that they're called the Holy Society, because they're doing the ultimate kind of kindness, which is being kind to people who can never repay them, right? Because the people have passed. So that says Chesed Shalom. Every time we are kind to somebody, even if we're altruistic, are we really altruistic? You never know. Maybe they'll reciprocate. Maybe karma. Who knows? Whatever, right? They're never doing it. But when you're being kind to somebody who's passed away, there's no illusions that these people themselves are going to repay you in any way. So it's pure kindness. It's called true kindness. But they're called also the Holy Society because they're dealing with holy beings, with these bodies that are sacred, that are holy. And these holy societies, when they prepare a body for burial, when they handle the body, when they collect the body from wherever the body is, and when they prepare for the burial, the tower, the process that it goes through, throughout this process, the people that handle it with the utmost care. The body is never turned face down, because that would be disrespectful to the body. So it's always face up. When they speak around the body, they speak as if they're speaking in front of a living person. They don't speak, they wouldn't say anything that would be inappropriate to say in front of they would speak respectfully of the deceased and of the circumstance and the situation. So they're not disrespectful. Furthermore, they try to say psalms, to say holy words and verses during the time that they're together with the body. And even more so, every Jewish corpse is assigned an honor guard. Bodies are never left alone. From the moment the person passes away, we don't leave them alone. So usually you don't have to be necessarily in the same room. You can be in the other room, but there's always somebody called a shomer, a guard, somebody who always stands guard, as it were. Why? So there are various reasons for it. It's not important. The point is, though, that this guard is really more symbolic in a sense. I mean, yeah, there's the spiritual component of it, which is force of impurity that might want to attach to a body at the time that the person passed away because the body's vulnerable. There's the idea of other things. People might want to take advantage of a body, but even if the body was locked up somewhere, you would still afford them this honor guard that would. So here lies a very important being. This is not just a lump of matter that is just sitting around waiting to decompose. This is actually a sacred being that we're handling. Right? That's why you take a look at text 10. It talks about that, the respect that is afforded to the body with the honor guard. Okay. And figure 2.3 gives us a rundown of some of the things and the ways with which the body is treated after the person passes away up until the time of burial. Furthermore, when a person is buried, we make every effort to bury every part of that person. There's this organization in Israel called Zaka, which has gotten very famous. Unfortunately, you see them, whenever there's, God forbid, an accident or a terrorist attack or something, and there's a death and it's somewhat gruesome, and they need to go clean up a site where somebody has passed away, and they make every effort to collect every last bit of tissue, every last bit of blood. They would soak it up so that the person, as much of the person as can be recovered, should be buried together with the person, because it's not just the body as a whole that is sacred, but it's even the fragments of the body. Every part of the body which has been connected with that soul is sacred and holy, and therefore it would require proper burial. And so the same is true. This is more common even in hospital rooms. When a person passes away in the hospital, they're connected to pipes and to wires that they have to be taken out carefully so that there's no blood left in the wires. The blood is taken out. The sheets, the bed sheets, if there's blood, all of that gets buried together with the person. Every part of the person that can be recovered gets buried with that person. And so text 11 sums it up. There's no differentiation in reverential treatment between a complete Torah scroll and a single letter that has become detached from a Torah scroll. Similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body that was created in God's image. So that's how we look at the body. Now, we're going to turn to burial itself, right? So this is the time between death and burial, and the preparation to burial and how the body is treated. What about burial itself? So there's a mitzvah to bury the dead. Somebody passes away, they have to be buried. And we learn it actually from a very interesting source. Text 12, a verse in Deuteronomy. You shall surely bury him on that same day as his death. I say this is an interesting source for burial. This is where we have this commandment to bury the dead. And by the way, the fact that it should be on that day, on that same day in Israel to this day, people are buried even in the middle of the night. It's not uncommon to see burial because we don't want a person to be lying deceased and not have been buried till the next day. We make every effort to bury the person as close to death as possible. Practically, where it's not practical, again, we try to do it as close to the time of death as possible, not to leave a body lying around, because again, describing the transition that the soul is making, the body lying around is very painful for the soul, right? The soul can't get to that next stage if it's lying around. A body lying in a freezer, the soul is sort of stuck in that sense. And this transitional time is very painful. The soul wants to start going through those 3 days of going back and forth to the body as the body starts to decompose, so the soul can then move on. But if that is halted or stunted in some way, that stalls all of it. It can be very painful. The only exception is for delaying a funeral is if it would allow, if it would be to accord greater respect to the deceased, right? So if a person passed away and to bury them immediately, they wouldn't get a proper burial, proper send-off, the proper people wouldn't be there, they wouldn't receive the proper honor in that final journey. So then you can delay it for that reason, but not indefinitely and not for too long. Every effort is made to do it as soon as possible. Now, so that's from this verse. But why do I say this is an interesting verse? Because this verse is talking about somebody who's executed by the high court.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
Everything that's going on nowadays with the ability to do things and the ability to get people together and the ability, it seems sometimes, to even have funerals, is that a justification for delaying a burial?
What do you mean? Because people can join on Zoom, you mean, or?
No, I mean, for a period of time at the beginning of the pandemic, you couldn't even, you couldn't even get people together. You couldn't, you couldn't do that. I mean, the law was preventing you to some extent from doing that. Is that a justification for delaying a burial?
It wouldn't be a justification. Again, everything has to be considered. It's not a one size fits all answer to all of that, right? Every circumstance is unique, and you have to weigh all of those elements and those factors. But it was certainly in the beginning of the pandemic in particular, it was terrible. So many people were dying. And one of the things that to me was one of the most harrowing scenes of this pandemic was seeing Chevra Kadisha, the holy society, right? This burial society in full hazmat suits, taking somebody to be buried. It was so jarring, and it felt so out of place. Listen, they did what had to be done to stay safe, but it was very distressing. Interestingly, in the beginning, when this hit, and I know particularly in the Orthodox communities up in New York, where there were multiple funerals every day, where the funeral homes, the chapels were literally backed up, it was just terrible. One of the things that they started to do then was Florida's the topography is not exactly the same, and it's not exactly the same here, but in New York, they would have the hearse ride through the neighborhoods, and people would come out to their porch to try and escort this person during the funeral. Usually they'd gather to one location, but here nobody can participate, nobody can get together and congregate. So people would come out to their porches as the hearse would sort of travel through the neighborhood. In a sense, some people during the pandemic, they found this sort of workaround where for many people, they had a bigger funeral than they might have otherwise had, because it sort of passed by everybody and more people were able to participate. Unfortunately, that was the exception. For the most part, it seems like that wasn't the case for people, tragically. Just another element of tragedy on top of this tragic situation. Okay, so I'm saying, but the point here, getting back to text 12, we're saying that this principle of burying the dead and doing it as soon as possible, at the respect, the reverence that we have and for the body and for the soul and for that process, That applies even to somebody who was sentenced to death, meaning somebody who's fallen through the cracks and become the lowest of the low. Literally, somebody condemned to death is now, we have to afford them this ultimate respect after that. Now, there's more to talk about this topic, about the dead and repentance with the death penalty. That's really not tonight's topic, so we're going to move on. But the point is, we see that this idea is so important and extends to everyone. Okay, so let's move on. I'm just trying to toggle my screen here, see what's going on. Here we go. Okay, let's look at a verse from Ecclesiastes, text 13. People proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth as it was, while the spirit returns to God who bestowed it. So this is Ecclesiastes himself, King Solomon, telling us about this process. The dust returns to the earth. That's the body that returns to its source, which is the earth from whence it came, which is, we know that when God creates man, first man, he creates Adam. So Adam is created he fashions him from the earth. Right? And it says, the verse that says, Afar ata v'lasha, you're dust and you'll return to dust. So the body comes from the earth and returns to the earth. And the soul goes back to God who bestowed it. The soul comes from heaven. God breathes that in, part of God that comes from above, that returns. So everything goes back to its place, to its source. The body goes back to the ground, that's its source. The soul goes back to heaven, that's where it came from. Yeah, text 14 from Rabbi Chaim Vital from Lurianic Kabbalah. For you are dust and you will return to dust. The body comes from the earth and it is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there. Okay, and we know Torah, the Jewish tradition is full of stories of burial, right? So we know that Abraham, well, the first one, we find really the first instance of death. The Midrash tells us that Cain, well, the Torah tells us that Cain slays Abel, and Abel is laying there, his lifeless body is laying on the ground. And so the Midrash tells us, fills in some of the gaps, and says Adam is looking at his lifeless son, doesn't know what to do with him. He didn't know from death what was going on, what has to happen. So the Midrash tells us that Adam sees a raven, that's my son's teacher, a raven burying another raven that had died, burying it in the ground. And so from that, he learned that he has to bury the body, and so he buries his son Abel. So that's already a midrash. But we know that there's a big narrative in the Torah, the whole story of Abraham seeking a burial plot for his wife, for Sarah, after she passes away, he finds one in Hebron. We know that Isaac and Ishmael were told, bury their father Abraham. Jacob, when he goes down to Egypt, the last 17 years of his life, before he passes away, he tells his children, specifically Joseph, he says, when I die, I want you to bury me back up in the Holy Land. Take me back to Israel. Bury me in Israel. So burial is something that's talked about constantly. Joseph as well tells the Jewish people, when you're going to leave Egypt, I want you to take me. Joseph laid in a coffin in Egypt for 140 years, waiting to be buried, proper Jewish burial in Israel. We're told that God himself buries Moses. Moses, who dies at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God himself buries him. A very moving passage you can find in the book of Ruth, where Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah are going, they're following Naomi, their mother-in-law, back up. She's returning home to Israel. And Naomi tells her daughters-in-law, maybe go back to where you came from. They were non-Jewish women, Moabite women, go back to where you came from. I'll go back. She didn't know what was awaiting her back in the Holy Land. And she didn't want them to be burdened as well. So Orpah takes leave, she leaves. But Ruth very movingly declares her devotion to her mother-in-law Naomi and to the Jewish faith. And she says, your people are my people. Where you're going to sleep, I will sleep. Right? Where you will die, I will die. And where you will be buried, I will be. She said, so we see what's on her mind at the moment when, according to many of the sages, that was the moment of her conversion. Right? This declaration of fidelity with the Jewish people. One of the things that she says is that she'll be buried the proper Jewish burial. That's how central and important a Jewish burial is in our tradition. In modern times, we find that Israel goes to great lengths to retrieve bodies of soldiers, unfortunately, who had been abducted, even though they know that what they're getting back is corpses, to make sure that they receive a proper Jewish burial. Nobody respects the dead like the Jewish people. Okay, so This leads to a very important topic that unfortunately is becoming more and more of a problem today. Back in the 60s, I think it was, about under 4% of the population was being cremated. As of a couple of years ago, more than 50% of Americans that are dying are being cremated. And that number is expected to climb to close to 80% by 2035. So cremation it's a difficult topic. It's a painful topic to talk about because it's a very real topic, and we all probably know people, or either people that might be thinking about it for themselves, or people who have loved ones, people who have been cremated. So it is, I know that it's an emotionally charged topic, but it's an important topic to bring up and an important topic to talk about. So Judaism utterly rejects cremation. It's not an option, and rejects it in not so uncertain terms. Why? So what we've learned between last week and already this week, we can already understand a little bit of why cremation would be a problem. We know that death is not the end of life. And we just finished talking about how the body itself is holy, is sacred. And we talked about the fact that there's a certain life force of the soul that remains together with the body. So even though that departs, there's still always something, we'll get to it a little bit later tonight, there's always an element of the soul that will always remain with the body. So as much as the body is dead, the soul has left, but it's still a sacred being, it's still a sacred entity, and it still does have a certain life force that remains connected to it. To burn the body would do, number one, would be to, pardon me if this is a little jarring, but it would be it's not far off from burning somebody alive. You're taking a body that has a life in it and burning that life alive, essentially. Even a dead body, that's burning the life alive. That's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is that burning the body, if there's something that if you feel that it's yours, so you can feel free to do what you want with it. But as we said, you are from dust, and to dust you shall return, right? What does that tell us? A very core principle in Judaism is that we don't own our bodies. It's interesting that Judaism gives us more authority over our property than over ourselves. It sounds a little counterintuitive, right? But that's the case. Judaism doesn't encourage me going and just burning a perfectly good dining room table. It doesn't encourage that, and it actually would say that it's not a good thing to do. To be wasteful and to be destructive is not a good thing. But still, I have every right. It's my possession. If I want to burn it, I can burn it. Right? If I want to destroy it, if I want to be careless with it, that's my right. My body is not mine. My body is on loan from God. I didn't create it. I didn't make it myself. It comes from God, which is why it has to be returned to its sender. So I'm not free to do with my body as I please. Burning the body, cremation says, it's my body, this is mine, I can do with it as I want. Another thing is that you don't burn something if you think you might need it again. And if I have something that is just sitting on my shelf, it's making me nervous, if I'm certain that I'm never going to use it ever again, I'll give it away, I'll donate it, I can burn it, whatever. But if there's a chance that I might want this again, I might be in need of it again, then I'm not going to destroy it. It's something I'm going to return to. Similarly, we know that a very important core Jewish principle, is the resurrection of the dead. That in the Messianic era, the soul will return to the body. Now, we're going to talk about the resurrection in lesson 6. We're going to get to the resurrection. So we're not going to go off onto that topic tonight, but let's just keep at this point here, that the resurrection is the reunification of the soul with the body in which it performed all the commandments during its lifetime, in which it lived its life during this lifetime. To burn the body would be to say that I don't believe that one doesn't believe in the resurrection, that this body ain't coming back, that this is that death is final, and it's the finality of this union of body and soul. So in other faiths where they value the afterlife, right, where there's an afterlife, we already established there really is no afterlife. It's just life just continues in a different form. where the whole point is to get through this life, to get to the next life. Yeah, you can burn the body, you're not going to need it again. The lifetime, the body and the soul union is an inconvenience at best. So once we're done with it, we moved on to bigger and better things. Sayonara, see you later. Judaism doesn't look at it that way. Ultimately, we're going to come back. Ultimately, the soul and the body are going to be reunited. Furthermore, to destroy a body, and this is a little bit, maybe just aside, a little tangent, but we talked last week, right, about living a soulful life, living a purpose-driven life, which can only be lived with body and soul together. So you live a life in this world, a full life, body and soul together. The only way the soul can fulfill its purpose and make a difference in God's vast eternal plan is in this body. And then once it's done, you say, body, thank you, it was a nice ride. Sayonara, I don't need you anymore. We're destroying you, destroying the evidence. It's just not nice. It's not nice. There is a little bit of recognition to the fact that the only place the soul was able to do any of these lofty things was in that body. A little respect, a little appreciation. So cremation is a rejection of these ideas. It's a rejection of the idea that body is not mine, but it's God's, on loan from God. And it's a rejection of the idea of the resurrection of the dead. Now, I just want to, when we talk about this topic, so people often bring up the Holocaust and the crematoriums and the Jews that were cremated. I want to make it clear. So people, when people talk about this topic, and you'll often hear people say incorrectly that you can't cremate because a person who's cremated can't be resurrected because there's nothing left of the body. That is an incorrect statement. What I said was that choosing to be cremated is a statement that that person who's choosing to be cremated is rejecting resurrection. Right now, somebody who rejects it says, I deny it. They deny the possibility. God says, listen, I'm not going to force you. You don't want to be resurrected. You won't be resurrected. I'm not going to force you to do it. Now, the truth is, even somebody who's cremated in that way, even those people will be resurrected in a different kind of form, but not with that same body. But it's not that resurrection, that cremation means that God no longer can rebuild the body. Because look, the person's buried in the ground, the body decomposes, right? There's nothing left eventually, or not much left. So either way, there's going to have to be a lot of reconstructing of the body for the person. It's not like the body remains intact. So what's the difference if it's a pile of ashes or if it's just bone fragments or corpse dust? What's the difference? It's not that God can't do it. God can reconstruct people from ashes, and all the people that perished in the Holocaust will all be reconstructed from ashes. It's not that he can't do it. It's the statement that the person who chooses it is making that they're denying this reality. That's the point. Not that God can't or won't resurrect somebody from the ashes, that it's too difficult. That's a misconception I think is important to have mentioned. Now, because of the severity of cremation, so historically, Jewish communities have enacted all kinds of laws, and some of them are really harsh to prevent people from cremation. So particularly when it started to take root in the Jewish community, so the communities basically said that if somebody chooses to be cremated, the family doesn't sit shiva. There's actually a discussion as to whether and also the ashes are not buried in a Jewish cemetery. The ashes are not buried. There's a discussion, a debate as to whether the family can say Kaddish for that person even. So you see the extent, how seriously they took this and how they tried to create this deterrent to prevent people from choosing cremation. Now, having said that, practically speaking, those laws were enacted really, there was a battle that was being fought. There was an ideological battle that was being fought where people were turning away from Judaism, were rejecting Jewish values and faith, and even though they knew better, and were basically proclaiming that they deny any of these values, right, and ideals. So to fight that battle, the communities and the rabbis felt that they needed to draw those battle lines. Today, the vast majority of people who are cremated, unfortunately, do so with absolutely no knowledge and no awareness. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know, so they're not making any statements. They're not implying anything by doing it. They never heard that there even is a resurrection to know whether they believe in it or not. Most people are completely ignorant, sadly. It's terrible, but most people are ignorant. So obviously somebody who's ignorant, somebody who doesn't know, won't be judged by the fact that they don't know. But if we know somebody that's entertaining it, we do have an obligation to try and inform them, to try and encourage them to have a proper burial. Because while ignorance is certainly not held against somebody, but it's not a virtue to be ignorant. And so we want to try and as I mentioned, the first point I mentioned, which is like burning a live body, the pain that the person suffers is we want to try and avoid that. Which leads to the one final point on this topic, which is what happens if somebody's last wishes are to be cremated, right? And you want to obey their wishes. We know that in Judaism, you'll see in text 15a, 15b, that somebody who's passing away, that we try as much as we can to follow their last wishes, the last will and testament. We try to do whatever it is that they ask for. So if they ask to be cremated, shouldn't we honor that? Or is that even binding? So the answer is no, it's not binding. Why is it not binding? First of all, because the person doesn't have a right to uproot something that's a Torah value. So according to Judaism, one has to be buried. That's a requirement. And cremation is a prohibition. A person is not free to choose something that he's not allowed to choose. And so therefore, that's not listened to. That's number one. And number two, when a person passes away and the soul leaves the body, so even as the soul is still transitioning, remember, but the soul is already seeing the body from the outside as well. And the soul is already experiencing an element of the world of truth. And when the soul is experiencing an element of the world of truth, the soul is starting to see things differently. And the soul is starting to see truth. And so even though the soul, while it was in the body, maybe felt there was nothing wrong with cremation, or had never heard of anything, it was completely innocent or whatever, but now, the soul right now, at that moment after death, does know the truth. And right now, the soul doesn't want to be cremated. That's the soul's wishes right now. And so therefore, we're honoring the soul by going against their explicitly stated wishes, which were to be cremated. We're actually honoring them. This is particularly a sensitive topic when you're talking about children burying a parent, and the parent had those wishes, and we know there's a value to honor your parents, and sometimes people feel that they're not obeying and they're being disobedient, and the truth is no. They have to understand that now when their parents are in the world of truth, this is what they want, and to give them a proper Jewish burial is to honor them in a very meaningful way. And in a sense, it's the most meaningful way because the person doing it might not even be so convinced, they might not feel so good about it. They're doing it simply because they know it's the right thing for their parent and because it's what's going to give their parent pleasure. Okay, so that's the story with cremation, which brings us to and burial, brings us to our final point tonight. The final point tonight is visiting a grave after a person passes away. So we mentioned the person passes away, they receive the proper burial. Now, we mentioned that the soul leaves the body, right? And it goes through in stages. So what would be the point of visiting the grave? So let's take a look here at text 16. Text 16 on page 66 from the Zohar. The nefesh, remember we had this word right in the beginning, the nefesh, right? That lowest level of the soul, the lowest part, the part of the soul that animates the body. The nefesh remains present in the grave. Due to the fact that it remains among the living, it is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. This is a very interesting statement, right? When the soul leaves the body, it goes up to heaven, it goes back to being the soul. So remember, we mentioned that there's this difficult transition that the soul goes through because it's become accustomed to being in a body, and now to go back to just being a soul without a body is unfamiliar and can be painful and uncomfortable, right? But ultimately, it doesn't take long for the soul to be floating around on clouds, watching angels float by, playing their harps, and suddenly forget about the grind in this world, right? But there's the part of the soul, the part that remains connected to the body, that part doesn't really forget. That part still remains connected. And so therefore, think about it, and we'll get into this topic a little bit now, but we go to visit the graves of loved ones, and we pray, and we hope, there's a very popular Jewish blessing we give to people that their loved ones on high should intercede on their behalf and should be good advocates for them up on high. But think about it. Why would your loved ones that are on high, that have not been in this world for many years, how good is their advocacy up there? What are they going to be praying for? I'm here, I need to pay my mortgage. The soul in heaven, my grandmother hasn't paid a mortgage in many, many years. What does she know about that stress? So she's worried about soul things. My soul, I don't have time to worry about my soul problems because I'm too busy worrying about my mortgage. So like, what's the, right? So there's sometimes there could be a little bit of a disconnect in a sense. We've talked about the positive sides. We connect on that soulful level and so on. But how does that work? So the nefesh part of the soul always remains connected and still retains that information, which is why that soul could advocate on our behalf, because they were once here. They were once us. Okay. When the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the nefesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the ruach, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world. So essentially what we're saying here is that the grave site, is a direct portal to heaven. Why? Because the soul that remains, the part of the soul remains at the grave, has a direct line of communication with its next level up, which is the ruach, which is in heaven, which, as we mentioned, was in paradise, in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. And that part of the soul that relays it to goes and prays and asks God on his behalf. So we see, and the Zohar is filled with such references to this idea that the ones who passed away sustain the world in a sense, because they pray on high for life in this world. Let's look at text 17. There was once a community that wished to relocate. There was once a community. This is a text. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid wrote Sefer Chassidim. So this is an ancient text. It's almost 1,000 years old, and he says like this: there was once a community that wished to relocate. One of the deceased buried in the vicinity appeared in a dream to a member of the community and pleaded, "Please do not abandon us, for we appreciate your visits to our cemetery." Barzillai, the Gileadite, Barzillai HaGiladi, declared, this is already now getting into the Bible, he's quoting here, "I would like to die in my own city." He wished for this because the deceased appreciate when their loved ones visit their graves and request goodness for their souls. This improves their condition in heaven. And when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in turn. So here's something interesting. Just the reference here to Barzillai in the story of King David when he had to run away from his son Absalom, right? Is that how you say it in English? Absalom? Whatever. Who cares? Avshalom, his son, led a revolt against his father, against King David. And King David had to run away from Jerusalem. And while he was running, he came to a place. Barzillai was an elder of the community who offered him food and drink, and they took care of King David while he was on the run. So King David, in return, once he put down the rebellion and was able to return safely to Jerusalem, he invited Barzillai. He said, "Come, join me in Jerusalem, and I will treat you very well." Out of appreciation, Barzillai said, I'd rather stay here, thank you very much, because he was old, he was aging, and he was going to die soon, and he felt he wanted to remain there in his hometown where he can be buried, so that he could be next to his family, who can come and visit him, and so on. So we see that there's this value in being close to family. Why? Says, as the Sefer Chassidim says here, because when we go to our loved ones and pray at their grave sites, we're remembering them, we're connecting with them, we're honoring them. That does wonders for them up in heaven. When in heaven they see that people have not forgotten them, it means they're still impactful. It means they're still having an impact in this world, right? Which is very special. As we said, one of the biggest tragedy in death for the soul is that it could no longer be effective in this world. But when we connect with them, and particularly when we go to visit their grave, and where there's that energy still is physically located. Obviously, we started the class by saying you can tap into that energy everywhere. That's true. But going to the grave, taking the time, we're connecting with them in a very tangible way, in a very real way, and a very personal way. And so therefore, that is a benefit to the soul, which then in turn prays on behalf of those of their loved ones. So there's a custom that when you visit the grave of a loved one, that we place a rock on the grave. So one of the reasons for that is to mark the site. Somebody was here. Somebody was visiting, and that's an honor and a source of blessing for the soul, that it's a grave that's visited, that people come to visit. That's a person that hasn't been forgotten. And particularly special days that we're feeling very inspired, are good days also certainly to go to the cemetery and to go visit loved ones. A yard site is obviously a wonderful time to do it, and even the end of a month, before Rosh Hashanah is a good time. These are appropriate times to have this mutual connection with our loved ones, and where we benefit them and they benefit us in that very way.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If their soul isn't there at the burial site, then why do we need to go to the burial site when they could be with us?
Right.
In
So
spirit.
there's an element of the soul that still remains. Everything we talked about, even with the soul going up, right? But the nefesh, as we said, we read in the previous text, the nefesh, there's an element of the nefesh that still remains. So even though most of the nefesh level, that lowest level of the soul, does depart, but there's something that's called like the bone vapor of the body. The vapor meaning the moisture, which that's like a reference to the life force, the essence of that physical matter that still remains in the grave. And that's that link, that connection with the rest of the soul. It also says that a tombstone is like a seat for the soul. That's why it's important to put up a stone, to put a marker on a grave, not just so you know that there's a grave there, but also it's like it serves as sort of a place where the soul can sit, where it hovers around the grave. So there's always that connection that remains there. Let's wrap it up tonight with a letter, text 18, a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's a letter that the Rebbe wrote to, and we're going to just conclude with this, and then we'll open it up to some more questions. Okay, this is a letter that the Rebbe wrote to Chana Sharfstein, a woman in Crown Heights, who has an interesting, close bond with the Rebbe, close relationship. She was from Boston. Her father, Rabbi Yisrael Zuber, was the rabbi, Chabad rabbi in Boston, come over from Russia. And he passed away very young. I believe it was in a car accident, if I'm not mistaken, at a very young age. And so she, as a young, I think she's a teenager, she already lost her father. And in a span of 5 years, she lost her father, her mother, and her mother-in-law. And she was very young and very distraught and devastated. And she had already had this close bond with the Rebbe, close relationship and these correspondence with the Rebbe. And she'd written to the Rebbe about her grief. And let's read the Rebbe's response to her here in text 18. This is a letter. This is an original. This is not a translation from the Hebrew. This was written in English. So let's take a look. Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father. Peace unto them. Right. So the first point the Rebbe is going to make here, that we just have here with the dots, is that obviously we don't understand God. We don't understand God's ways. That was an issue that had been raised in the letter that the Rebbe was addressing. But we don't understand it. But that's not that is a bigger conversation than what we're having tonight. Let's continue with the next point. Another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in this physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it is no longer handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. In view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which, as noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level, and all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here. I think that letter written to a grieving daughter really sums up tonight's class, really kind of the first two classes. And next week, we're going to take a look at the grieving process, what that looks like for those who have lost. And that will be, God willing, next week's topic.